In this video, I'm going to share some things with you that helped me maximize my hobby time. Hey, I'm John. Thanks for joining me for this video today. When I first got back into modeling in 2006, I'd often find myself sitting at our kitchen table where I used to do all my modeling, and I would start work on things, but then I would start getting a little off track and maybe looking at this or remembering that I needed to do that, or hey, what color was supposed to go here? Well, how did this thing look in real life? And while I finished a lot of models, quite often it was not an easy, pleasant process. Many times I found that I became my own worst enemy in terms of just getting things done. So I really began to focus on the process of building models and maximizing my time that I have to do the hobby. Now, certainly everybody has different goals and different plans and different processes and different things they like doing when they're working on their models. So please don't see this as a hard and fast list. It's simply things that have worked for me, and it may spark some ideas for you. But the goal is, whatever you do with this information, even if you don't use any of it, the goal is to help you work towards being more efficient and maximizing the time that you have to work on the hobby. Because, life's busy. We've got a lot of things going on. And so getting the most out of the time we have available really makes the hobby that much more fun. I think one of the most helpful things that I have found in my own model building is, from the very beginning, just pull out the instructions and the kit parts and just go through it and mentally build the model. I look at each step in the process, and I look at each part on the sprue, and I just kind of take that through and see, okay, this goes to this and that goes to that. And that helps me really plan out the build and avoid a lot of problems down the road. Some of the things that I get from this are, I can see what needs to be painted ahead of time. Quite often there's parts on a model that are best painted before any assembly is done, or that needs to be done as a sub-assembly that will go inside of a large assembly. So pre-planning really helps me there. It also helps me to see where there's going to be some seam work that needs to be accounted for, because sometimes I'll take some parts and I'll test fit them together during this pre-planning phase, and I'll see that, okay, there's going to be a fairly significant seam line, and I can go ahead of time and decide, how do I want to factor that into the build. Another thing I do in this phase is I look and decide when I'm going to prime the parts. Sometimes if it's a model that can pretty much be fully assembled and then painted, well, then I just prime it all at the end once it's all assembled. But sometimes if you have different sections, say interiors or engine parts or other things, sometimes you have to prime those and paint those ahead of time, and then put other things around it and have a plan for potentially masking that off, covering that up, whatever, to do additional priming. So a build plan is going to help you determine when you need to do those things. And then a final thing that I like to do when it comes to that build planning is just simply make notes on the instructions. I may make note, circle something to say, hey, you've got to build 2 of these, or these parts look alike, but they're not quite exactly alike. There's a left hand and a right hand, so you've got to factor that in. And then many times I'll go through and I'll look for areas that might need holes drilled out, or sections that have some kind of modification done before assembly, and I'll highlight those with a highlighter so I don't miss them, and later have to figure out, how am I going to drill that hole somewhere on this flat panel to get this other piece on. Now, besides the preparations that are done with the instructions, there's also some preparation that can be done apart from the kit. For example, one of the things I like to do is I like to look up on the internet and find examples of what I'm building. If it's a science fiction subject, maybe it's the way it looked in a movie or in an anime series or in something like that. If it's a real world subject, I'll look for, a real world photo of it in action. And then I'll also look at the way other people have done it to get ideas and inspiration for anything from colors to weathering and that kind of thing. So doing that pre-preparation in terms of the way it's going to look will really help you get in your mind the target that you're going for. And quite often, I'll print those out, or I'll keep them in a file so that I can have it pulled up on my computer screen that I can look at while I'm working so that it's right there in front of me. Doing that kind of research work really pays off in the end. Another thing I try to do in the preparation phase is to get all my paints together. It can be much easier to know, okay, do I have enough of this paint? Have I identified the paints that I want? If there's going to be some mixing involved, maybe doing some test mixes ahead of time and comparing them. And even quite often, I'll even mix up, I'll find some empty bottles and I'll actually mix up the color ahead of time. So I've got it prepared and ready to go, and it's not something that I'll have to think about later. It's right there and I can just grab it and go. Another thing that helps me a lot, and I mean a lot, when I'm preparing to work on a new build is I clean my model desk up. And I mean, I take everything off of it that doesn't need to be there. I put away paints, I put away paint brushes, I put away old kits, I sweep it off, I get it completely clean, because I find that when I have a fresh, clean, open work area to start out on, it kind of starts the model off on the right foot. If I leave other stuff out there and leave it kind of messy, I kind of go into it almost with that attitude, kind of a messy attitude. But when I've got everything cleaned up, I seem to approach it from a much different mindset, and that start gives me some momentum that carries me through as I'm doing the build. And then throughout the build, I'll continue to do that. Just clean up the workspace, maybe at the end of each session or at the end of each evening or every couple of days, just to make sure that the focus can be on the work and not on all the clutter that's around it. Now in the planning phase, I will have determined what are the subsections that I want to build the model in. And I may even use my pen or my highlighter to group the sections of the instructions so I know what I'm doing. So when it comes time to build, I start in on those subsections. I don't look at the model as necessarily one whole model, but I tend to look at it as lots of little models that in the end get built up into a bigger model. It kind of helps me bite off smaller chunks. You may have heard the old saying about, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So when I've got a model, that's kind of the way I view it. How can I do this one bite at a time? I generally start by focusing on any interior details or hard to reach details first, and I get those primed and painted and ready to go. And I really do treat them as a separate model. Recently I was working on a machining Krieger kit that has an engine on the inside of it, and I really treated that engine as its own model. I put everything else aside. I focused on just the parts for the engine, and in my mind that was the goal, finishing that model of the engine. That was my whole goal. I didn't worry about the rest of it. My focus was on that. Same way if there are particular gun sections or other parts that will later go onto it that are a logical different section. I like to work on those and kind of break it down so that I have those and they're just little subsets of the bigger task. Another way that I'll break models up into sections to just help me mentally tackle what I'm doing is to look at not only where they at in the assembly, but what's the materials that they're supposed to represent. So for example, if I'm building a gun plate and there's going to be some inner frame parts, I tend to treat that as one subsection. The outer armor parts, I treat that as another subsection. The guns will be another subsection. If it's another kind of model, another genre maybe, and there are some textures on it that are supposed to be cloth or leather or something like that, if it makes sense in the build sequence to treat those differently, I'll focus on those as a subset, as a small task within the bigger set of tasks. And sometimes these subsections, I'll even modify the build sequence or modify the parts themselves so that I can put 2 or 3 or 4 parts together that if you go by the instructions wouldn't necessarily work that way. But if you modify them just a little, you can get some parts together, do the sanding and cleaning up on it, and then slide something else into it or glue something else onto it that wasn't necessarily that way in the build instructions. But in the pre-planning phase, I saw, hey, I can modify the process, and this is going to make it easier so I can get this part done separately and then this part done separately, and they'll all come together in the end, and it's going to make it much easier. Another thing I do when I start building in various sections and subsections, especially when I get to the painting and even the weathering, is I start to look at how I do those based on drying and curing times of the products that I'm using. So for example, if I'm going to be putting on some oils on one part, then I'll say, okay, this day's task is to do maybe the dot filter on this, or it's to do some panel lining or something else like that. And I will do what needs to be done for that day to allow for the drying time, say of oils or enamels or something like that, so that when I come back the next day, they'll either be dry or I'll have planned to work on another section that may not require that drying time. And thus I can work continually every day, but never have to worry about, is this dry or has this cured or is there going to be any kind of interaction? Because for the most part, I can plan things so that I don't ever have to worry about that. Another thing I do in just the day-to-day building of things is when I say, okay, this day, this is what I'm going to accomplish or try to accomplish, is I don't overstep that. I don't rush to get through that so that I can get on to something else, but rather I say, okay, this is what I've planned for this day. I'm going to maximize the time I have for this day on that task. After I started doing that, I became fairly good at figuring up what I could get done in a day. And so some days it might not seem like a whole lot that I got done in terms of the overall project. But for that particular piece or subsection, it got a whole lot done. It pushed the ball down the field a whole lot further because that day's work was critical to get done so that, like I said, I could let something dry or I could have it prepared to go into something else the next day that was the next thing that needed work. Now sometimes I will finish up what I've been working on. I'll have put plenty of time into it. I'll be really happy with the result and I'll go, okay, I'm done with this day's tasks. And I'll see that I have plenty of time left in whatever time I have available for doing my hobby things. Now, when that happens, I pick one of two routes. Sometimes I'll look at, okay, here's what I had planned to get done tomorrow. Is this something I have time to start now so that I can do it either to a logical stopping point or get it fully completed and go ahead and knock that task out too? If I can, I'll quite often continue on into whatever the next subtask is, or maybe I'll jump over to another section because I know, well, the thing I just finished, I have to let that dry, but there's some other stuff over here that's completely unrelated that I can go ahead and get that done and then set that aside and then come back the next day to this thing that I just finished at first, and it just keeps everything rolling down the field. Now, there are times when I finish up that day's task and I'll look at it and I'm satisfied with it, and then I'll see, you know, here's some other stuff I could do, but I sit back and I look at it and I think, you know, I need to give myself some time away from the hobby desk. Maybe I'll go for a walk or, you know, sit and watch something on TV with my wife or take a nap, you know, do something around the house that needs to be done. I think giving ourselves breaks from the hobby, I know for me it's very important because I can get so focused on that I can often sit up from the hobby and figuratively look around and go, I've had my head down in this for every hour that I've not either been sleeping or at work, and I need to back away from it. So sometimes backing away for just a little bit is going to make you more efficient in the long run. So look for those opportunities too. Now in any build, there's times when I run into roadblocks. Maybe it's forgetting to do something or something not fitting the way I thought it would. You know, there have been times when I've thought I did the test fitting and planning well, And then when I got to that point of, okay, it's time to execute, somehow I missed something, or something in the mix changed. So working around roadblocks is a very important thing in maximizing your hobby time. One of the disciplines I try to practice in avoiding roadblocks is whenever I make a mistake, fix it. I don't wait to go back and try and do it later, but I try and fix it right then. Maybe it's going to be repainting something, maybe it's scraping some paint away, refilling a seam, doing something like that. I try and fix it right then. Now, there are times I don't, because I can look at a part and I might say, you know what, I was already planning on weathering that very heavy. I'll just make sure to weather it a little heavier right there and cover that up. But making sure that something is fixed as soon as possible, or that you have a definite plan of how you're going to deal with it, is going to help avoid roadblocks that when you get down the road, you may look at it and go, oh, I should have fixed that back then because now it's a lot harder. Sometimes I do run into things that I forgot to do earlier on, or that are, unintended and unanticipated events during the build. And sometimes those can be very frustrating, and they can present a very strong roadblock, a mental roadblock to what I'm trying to get done. Oftentimes when I run into those, instead of sitting and dwelling on it and stewing on that one problem, I'll actually just set the model aside, and then I'll pick up what I call a relief valve kit. Just a kit that I keep going on just as an ongoing build. It may not ever make it to video or anything like that. It's just something that I have going on that's just kind of a side project, that if I get frustrated with what I'm working on or run into a problem that I can't really resolve right then what I'll do is I'll pull that relief valve kit out and I'll start working on that. And because I don't really have too many goals for that relief valve kit, I can actually be thinking of how to fix this other kit that is the original roadblock. And so I can be working at something and be happily working and enjoying the process of what I'm doing, but the whole while my mind is kicking over, how can I fix that? And almost always, I get a few minutes into that build of that relief valve kit, and suddenly my mind will come up with some solution, and then I set that down, go back to the other one, get it resolved, and keep moving on. So there are times that having a side project really helps with letting you think about the original project while still working on something to keep your mind actively engaged. Now, sometimes I run into a roadblock that I sit back and I look at it, and I may set the model aside and go do something else or work on another kit. And at the end of the day, I come back and look at it and go, it is what it is. The path back to resolving whatever it is I'm not liking is just far too long of a path to get involved in, to try and correct. It may not mean that the model looks necessarily bad, but it may just not be going fully in the direction I want. And a lot of times in those cases, I look at it and I say, okay, what can I do to get the most out of what time is left and get this thing finished? And then just basically work on the principle that there's always another model coming along. Because if you build continually like I do, you're never on your last model. At least you hope you're not. And so there's always going to be something else coming along that you can work on. So I'll often just say, you know what, I'm gonna continue with what I've got. I'm going to drive on. I'm going to maximize it, finish it up, set it aside, and keep moving. Now, eventually, you finish the model. It's got everything done to it that you want done, and whether you're happy with it or not, it's completed. And you set it aside, you put it on your shelf, you do whatever you're going to do with it, and you start thinking about the next build. But before I get into the next build, I always like to review what I did in the previous build. If there were things that I didn't really like, I try to examine why I didn't like them. What happened in the process that made it go off into a direction that I really wasn't happy with. Another thing I like to do when I'm evaluating a build at the end to help me in my processes for future builds is look at the products and tools that I used in the build and see, okay, what really helped? Was there something that added to this? Was there something I used that maybe didn't really do all that much for me? Was there a paint that particularly seemed to work well, or was something I hadn't used that I want to make use of in the future again? Or was there one that I used that, you know, it sounded like a good idea, but it didn't really do that much for me? The same way with tools. Did any new tools, did they really contribute to the build? Or was there anything in terms of tools that throughout the build I wished I would have had to make it a little easier or to make the project look a little better? So an evaluation of tools and materials and paints and things like that will also pay off on future builds, because then you can then factor them in, and if it's something that you were using for the first time on one build, then you'll say, well, I want to make sure I do this on the next one. Or if it's something that you wish you would have had, that you'll make sure you get that before the next build starts. Now, as you're listening to this, if you're thinking this sounds like a way too complicated way to build a model, I understand that. It's not for everybody. I like to have things planned out. I feel much more relaxed and much more comfortable when I have things planned out. When I know that, okay, next Tuesday, my plan is to have this completed on the model. If I know I've got that in the plans and I can see that I'm going to make it to that point, then I'm much more relaxed and I'm actually having much more fun than if I'm just, okay, let me just sit down and do some stuff and see where it comes out. Even before I started doing videos, I tended to plan my builds very carefully, again, because that's just the way my weird mind is wired. Now that I'm doing videos, it's even more helpful. So this may not be for everybody. For some people, there may have been a few ideas in what I've talked about that you may go, hey, I can work that in, but all of this other stuff, that's a little too much for me. And again, I get it. If you're happy sitting down and looking at what's on your desk and just picking up a part here and picking up a part there and sanding this and painting that and doing some stuff, and you just keep doing that over and over until eventually it's finished, keep doing it. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you want to be more organized about it and you want to squeeze out the most from the time you have available, and you've got more of an ordered mind like I do, where things have to be lined up like that, then try some of these ideas out. They may help you, because the goal is not just to have an orderly build going on, but the goal is to have more fun. Like I said, planning removes for me what are obstacles that I tend to get wired up about. When I plan and those things are no longer obstacles, I'm much happier about my build, because then I know, okay, today I'm going to sit down and I'm going to chip this side of the model. And that's all I have to focus on. And if I get beyond that, that's okay. But I can know the next day I start in on the next thing. And it just helps me have fun, which is really the goal of the whole process. Well, thank you so much for watching this video. If you're still hanging around at this point, I am so grateful, because I know sometimes these videos where I just sit and talk and, you know, as Led Zeppelin said, ramble on. I know sometimes that can maybe be a little bit of a yawner, so I do apologize for that. But thank you for hanging around till the end, and I hope that you've gotten at least a few ideas that are going to be helpful in your modeling. Now, if you've not already done so, please do click the subscribe button down over here, and there's a little bell icon. If you'd hit that, you'll know when I have new videos out. I've also added a join icon there so that you can join and become a member on YouTube. And if you click that, you can see the things that are available. Or if you would like to support me on Patreon, I have the same rewards available there, and even a higher tier that I can offer on Patreon that's available. So there's a link down below in the description if you want to check that out. And if you're already supporting my work, whether it's on YouTube or Patreon, thank you so much. You really do make this possible. I couldn't do the work that I do with the materials I do at the pace that I do if it weren't for you. We simply couldn't afford it. So from my family and I, thank you. And with all that being said, I'll leave you with one final thought, as I always like to do. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.